Oh, hi. I didn't notice you coming in. I was just about to read a little story called "The Net is Torn and the Thing is Gone" that, well, I wrote, and a talented friend, Lauren Poor, drew the cover up. And there's a picture of clam on the title page. The net is torn and the thing is gone. This was the trick at Tess' laundrome. It only cost a quarter to wash your clothes, but $25 to dry them. Tess and her husband Wally were surprised by how often the tourists would agree to it, as if there weren't even time to line dry on vacation in Miami in December. Tess and Wally said 25 all day, and often the people they said it to wouldn't know exactly what they meant. Two little ladies, Doris and Maureen, sat on a bench in front of the port-holed washers. They were friends with Tess and Wally, and didn't have to pay because they watched the store whenever the owners went clamming on the merry golden tree. "I'm scared to death to talk to Ellen," Doris said as she painted her fingernails, long black fingernails that looked like the hands were what grew out of them. "She's getting to that age." When Tess looked at the nails, she thought the ladies' hands were little benches the nails lounged on. She listened to the ladies and watched Wally pour detergent in the wrong machine, but didn't tell him because she was listening to the ladies. "Which one's Ellen?" Maureen licked her fingers and turned the page of her reading trash. "She's my 16-year-old. She thinks everything everyone says is awkward. All she and her friends say in their text is how awkward everything people say is." Teenagers temporarily lose the ability to consider anything people say to them normal. Maureen said this without looking up from her trash. The normaler the thing you say to them is, the likelier they are to think it's the most awkward thing they've ever heard anybody say in their entire lives. Tess and Wally didn't have kids because one of them had a tube problem, but she thought if they did, then the kid would never think anything like that about them. The last conversation Tess and Wally had went like this: "What did you have for lunch?" "A hamburger." "What did you have?" "A sandwich." "That sounds good." It was. Conversations like that made Tess sad, but she didn't like going very much further with Wally because she was afraid to get into a fight. Wally had just gotten a catch weigher installed on the merry golden tree without telling Tess, and he kept calling it the gross net terror. On the night of his crime, rather than asking Wally about it and telling him it was too expensive for him to get without mentioning it to her, Tess took the manual after he fell asleep and read it in secret on the bathtub lip at home until she realized sleepily that half the manual's text was composed of the words gross, net, and tear. At 3:50 the next morning, she sent Wally this text message in her sleep: "Live in a hotel in Halifax that weighs 1,000 pounds." In this way, Wally realized what the trouble was, and so he decided to ask Tess if she wanted to go clamming with him, which she liked, but which he only ever asked her about after a fight. He asked her just as he finished pouring the detergent down the wrong hole. He said, "Let's let the ladies take over for a few days." Tess said okay, but noted to herself that it was the 13th time they'd been clamming that year, and so it was their 13th fight and everything. The left leg of the M on the merry golden tree's hull was scraped off. Wally had tried to remove it so he could rechristen her something he hadn't thought of yet. Tess had told him it was bad luck to rechristen ships, and he'd stopped to argue with her, and then they'd gone clamming. Now they were out in the Atlantic, clamming again in the merry golden tree. Tess put her phone on the nightstand and looked out the porthole while up on deck Wally backed the boat out of the dock. They managed to buy it by charging tourists way too much to use the dryers, and by choosing a poor boat like the Merry Golden Tree, which leaked and had little jib holes. Their previous owner was as vague about as Tess and Wally were about how much it is to dry your clothes at Tess Laundrome. She went up on deck to Wally. "Should we cast the net yet?" she asked, looking more at the jib and wondering if it was maybe moth-eaten. Wally's fingers still kind of hurt from unmooring the boat. They were that close to the dock, but she was just joking. "No," he said. While Wally sailed them to the good clamming spot, Tess considered every possible way that their 13th trip could turn out. The ship could sink, and they'd murmur a few nice last things to each other, or it could wreck on an island, and the challenges they'd face there would teach them all sorts of new marriage lessons. Or they'd go back to the laundromat, but somehow have figured out how to communicate. She thought these things, sitting alone on the berth. Tess and Wally clammed in the commercial style, with a big starboard net they hauled up together. They were doing this at dusk. They kept putting one hand in front of the other while Wally said things like, "Now," and "Okay." They kept touching each other by accident. It wasn't that they didn't like each other. In all likelihood, Wally would put the moves on Tess that night, and they'd both like it, but neither would say much. Finally the net came over the taffrail nice and full, and shaped overall like a light bulb. Mainly there were clams inside, but also a man-shaped thing they didn't recognize. Man-shaped for sure, but it seemed structured in crab. Its two jointed legs poked through the mesh, and moved up and down like red levers. Happily, the net effectively confined the animal's little clapping claws. Whale lice or something mounded between its plates. Tess and Wally both winced at the sight and dropped the net. The jointed legs inside moved faster. At the last of the sunset they moved, disgusted, down to the berthing. Tess wanted to ask Wally what that was and why he left it. She'd only left it because he had. She had a mind Wally arguing with her while the real one paced quietly. Tess said, "How are you?" instead. Wally laced his fingers together behind his back and pushed his brow as far down as it would go. He said, "I want to check the gross net terror." That was his answer to everything on the Merry Golden Tree. He'd gone straight for the tear button after they'd boarded, so it wouldn't count their weight as catch. They went back up, and Tess realized, or decided, that this was the ordeal they'd undergo on their 13th clamming expedition. Blobs of weld held to the terror to the wall by the deck wheel. Wally kneeled at it while Tess stepped carefully towards the bow, where they'd dropped the net to run. The mesh had been torn by claws, Tess reckoned. Whatever it was that they'd caught was a clever little fellow, and had taken its leave of them and the clams, and left the net shaped now like a popped balloon. Tess looked out into the ocean and decided the animal was a symbol of their marriage, either that, or of the fact that she and Wally had no children. It was some kind of a symbol of something. Wally came up behind her and said, "The gross net terror says we're 100 pounds heavy. It's all these clams." He took the net up and clams spilled out. Clams and a sprinkle of those little crustaceous things that had mounded between the missing animal's plates. A trail of them led below deck. "I guess this is 100 pounds, Wally said, bouncing the spilling net with one hand. He knew the missing catch was on the boat, and Tess knew too, and they both knew the other knew. "What do you mean?" Tess said anyway. It was a symbol, and it begged them to speak about it. "I don't know," Wally said, and Tess heard him say it and fail the symbol. "Then can you stop calling it a gross net terror?" "Yes." They didn't eat any of the clams. Some of the symbol's little parasites got on them. Instead, they ate rehydrated beef stroganoff and told each other it was good. Before they went to bed, Wally closed the berthing door. "Why are you doing that?" Tess asked from the berth. We always close the door, Wally said, which they didn't. But who could come in? Tess said. We're at sea. Right. After that, Wally almost didn't put the moves on Tess, but did. She almost brushed the moves off, but didn't. He fell asleep immediately after, and Tess lay awake thinking about how much meaning everything that was happening had, and how everything kept making so much sense. Waves of sense and meaning washed over her as she lay in bed. Maybe they'd have a child. After all, they were in the berth, although that didn't have anything to do with the symbol, wherever it was. On the other hand, it too had a misspelled name, Gross Net Terror, which meant she would have a baby. And maybe, she thought, the symbol was telling them by its presence that it was wrong to overcharge the tourists who wanted to dry clothes and were too dumb to consider line drying them. Its presence was telling them absolutely everything. Doris and Maureen's talk about teenagers made sense too, of course, because Tess's baby would eventually be a teenager, and teenagers are crabby. Tess laughed in the dark and finally decided that that was a stretch. At some point that night she thought she saw the animal walk by the door on its two funny little crab legs, thrusting out one after another like the walk of a little man. In the morning, Wally checked his phone before doing anything else. Tess, he said, shaking her bare shoulder. What? Wally gave her the phone and she read a text message she sent Wally at 4:14 a.m. It said, Gigantic Atlantic monster walked upright in sea caves 40 million years ago. Why did you send me that? Wally asked. Tess rolled around to face him while she considered telling him he knew exactly why she sent him that, or that she honestly didn't remember sending it on account of being asleep. But by the time she'd rolled all the way around, she decided, I thought you were further away. It would be the most meaningful thing she could tell him, and so she did, and he seemed to get it. All over the merry golden tree there were definitely sparse trails of the little whale lice or whatever they were from the gross net terror, including in front of the berthing door. On deck they gathered the clams that had all died overnight and threw them back into the Atlantic Ocean. They threw the net over too, which was moving with whale lice, while Tess tried to decide which of 3 different possible symbols the lice themselves were. Wally checked the boat's weight, and it was still 70 pounds more than it had been. We should get the boat cleaned, Wally said, snapping his hand over the side to catapult one of the infestations off of his knuckle. Why do you say that? Tess asked. I want to get rid of all the bugs. Where do you think they came from? Probably from that thing in your text message, that gross net terror, Wally said. Tess realized what he'd said slowly. But when she did, she rocketed into his arms so fast they could easily both have fallen right off the merry golden tree and gotten their clothes all wet, which wasn't lost on Tess, who immediately concluded 4 things about their laundromat. The boat never lost those 70 pounds, not even after her thorough cleaning and delousing on the pier, but Tess found this unimportant as the entity the weight composed had done its job, whatever its job was, and hence was now and forever inert. She never asked Wally if he disagreed with her analysis, but she figured he didn't. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I'll see you on another episode of House Call with Dr. Schranz.